Right, Mark 8, verse 11. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus to test him. They asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to it." Then they left him, got back into the boat and crossed over to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf and they had with them in the boat. "Be careful," Jesus warned them. "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." They discussed this with one another and said, "It's because we've got no bread." Aware of their discussion, Jesus said to them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls did you pick up?" 12, they replied. "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" They answered, 7. He said to them, "Do you still not understand?" They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit in the man's eyes and put hands on him, Jesus asked him, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around 𝗙𝗶𝗹𝗀𝗀. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at the disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then he called the crowd to him, along with his disciples, and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in the Father's glory with the holy angels." Over to you, Dave.
Okay, so just have your passage there in front of you, turn into it. Just want to start on this sort of think about this question. In team sports, what makes a great player? Well, in order for you to become a great player, you need to focus on more than just the ball. Because if you just focus on the ball, you won't be able to see anything else. You need your teammates, to help you to look up when they shout your name, when they give direction, because they can see better than you. Or if the gaffer's on the sideline, shouting instructions. But in order to have better vision, you have to listen. What we see in this passage is that how listening to Jesus improves our spiritual vision. But we'll also see in this passage there's lots of barriers to having spiritual vision. And one of those is complete blindness, because people don't listen. Some people are blind to the truth, to the facts, to reality. They deny the obvious because they're so arrogant and close-minded. And that's our first point. Some people are blind. Let's read verse 11 to 13. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus, to test him. They asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to it." Then he left them, got back into his boat, and crossed over to the other side. Up until this point in Mark's gospel, Jesus healed the sick. He's healed demon-possessed people, a paralyzed man, a woman who was bleeding for 10 years. He's resurrected a dead girl. And just last week, he's fed over 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. He's been a busy man. I think if you're not blown away by that, then you need your head checked. And the Jewish religious leaders come over to Jesus and say, we want another sign, a greater sign. We're still not convinced you're God. Jesus responds in deep sadness at their unbelief. And he's sort of saying, if you don't believe I am who I am because of what I've already done, then no more signs will be given to you. The problem with these lads is that they have an attitude problem. They're arrogant, they're know-it-alls, unteachable, closed-minded. They're spiritually blind. They can't see the truth. They can't see reality. Jesus doesn't waste his time with these lads. He just hops in the boat and moves on. If you're a non-Christian, you're spiritually blind. Listen to Jesus. Come to him with humility and openness so you can start to see reality. You're stumbling around in the darkness at the moment. You can't see the truth. But we are going to see that Jesus loves to open blind eyes. He wants people to see. This brings us to the second point. Disciples could see but not see. Spiritually we can see, but we can't really see because other things temporarily affect our vision and influence us from seeing spiritual reality. And on Zoom last Sunday, Pete had these virtual eyebrows, if any of you remember. And he was saying something, but I could only hear bits of what he was saying because I was confused by these new eyebrows. And he carried on like nothing's happening, like it was normal. I couldn't hear because my attention was elsewhere. My mind was elsewhere. I was focusing on these virtual eyebrows and I couldn't really hear anything. I was thinking, what's going on here? And this is what's sort of happening in the next part of this chapter. The disciples' attention and mind is elsewhere because they're distracted, so they are unable to hear clearly. Let's read verses 14 to 21. Disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for 1 loaf they had within the boat. Be careful, Jesus said to them, or Jesus warned them, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herods. They discussed this with one another and said, is it because we have no bread? Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. He said to them, do you still not understand? The disciples have their mind on lunch and the fact that they'd forgotten to bring lunch. Now Jesus, he wasn't concerned about this, as he points out, by the fact that last week he's fed over 5,000 people with 2 loaves and 5 fishes, and 4,000 people with 7 loaves. So why would he be worried about bread? But this is what's on the disciples' minds. They don't understand. They are quick to forget how radical Jesus is. Now in verse 15, Jesus gives the disciples a warning not only once, but twice. He says, be careful, watch out. So he's trying to make a point. He's trying to grab the disciples' attention. He's warning them about the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. Now as soon as the disciples hear this sentence, the only thing they seem to hear is the word yeast. And they think that Jesus is talking about bread. But they're totally missing the point about what Jesus is talking about. In verse 15, Jesus was actually referring to the conversation he's already had with the Jewish leaders. When he talks about the yeast of the Pharisees and that I've heard, it's a bit like saying be aware of COVID. It's unseen, it's widespread, it's everywhere, it's all over the country, all over the world. And it starts to influence everything. Like COVID has influenced everything in our lives, work, the way we socialize, church. Yeast is used to make bread rise by bacterial corruption. And yeast in this context is a symbol for sin. And Jesus telling his disciples, beware of the influence of the Pharisees and Herod. These were all influential people of the day. The Pharisees were all about strict rule keeping, and the Herodians were wealthy and politically involved. Jesus is warning the disciples here and saying, you may be following me now, but you're still going to be surrounded by the influence of these powerful voices. And Jesus says to them and to us, watch out for the yeast. What or who is influencing us now? What is contributing to our spiritual blindness? Are we getting caught up in all this stuff surrounding COVID on TV, on social media? Are we getting caught up in all the politics around it? Are we getting caught up with all the voices of public opinion? Are we getting caught up with all the conspiracy theories surrounding COVID? Are we getting caught up in all the rage and anger around the new restrictions? Is this making us more fearful and anxious? Are we joining all our mates on social media, character assassinating all the politicians and local leaders? Are we like the world around us, blaming everyone? We see it again on TV, on social media. Everyone's blaming everyone for this situation. Nobody wants to take responsibility for their actions. But we've all a part to play. The Bible says it's not I'm right and you're wrong. We're all wrong uns. We're all at the same time victims and victimizers. We need to watch out for the yeast of this world. TV, social media, and people's opinions make us blind to Jesus. And if we're not careful, we'll end up like the Pharisees. We need to protect ourselves from all these powerful voices by listening to Jesus. Jesus is calling us to live radical lives. This brings us to the third point and the last point. Listening to Jesus helps us see clearer. Christians, like disciples, are blinded by listening to the voices all around them, and it's only by coming to listening to Jesus that we can see clearer. We all stereotype people, and that blinds us to who the person really is. And when we do this, we view the person through our own opinions and what other people say about them, rather than who they really are. We stereotype people on Brack Road because they're all over the place on the ale. Or we say, or some people say, look at that lad over there on the gear, he's horrible, isn't he? Or some people might stereotype someone because they're from another country or they've got a different skin colour. And they say that, they're just here to abuse the system. But the problem is we've never actually had a conversation with that person. We know little or nothing about them. And even if they did come over and talk to us, we probably wouldn't really listen to what they say. We would still be blind to who they really are. The same thing is happening as we read on in this passage. The disciples are blind to who Jesus really is, but Jesus helps them to see clearer. Let's read verses 22 to 26. They came to Bethesda, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spat on the blind man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus said, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent them home saying, don't even go into the village. In verse 22, Jesus and the disciples are out of the boat. They're on dry land. It's not long before Jesus is out of the boat that he's confronted by this blind man who wants him to heal him. So he takes the blind man to a more private place. There isn't an audience. As the man can't see, Jesus appeals to his sense of touch by spitting on the man's eyes and by using his hands. At first the man can see, but its sight is blurry. But by the second time of Jesus touching his eyes, it says he saw everything clearly. Jesus might have cured this man's blindness in one go, but he chooses to do it in 2 stages. Like all of Jesus' healings, he's trying to teach us something. He was teaching us that when we're spiritually blind, it's only Jesus who can heal us. We need Jesus to open our eyes to who he is and why he has come. Let's read verses 27 to 33. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around 𝗙𝗶𝗹𝗀𝗀. On the way, he asked them, who do people say I am? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. But what about you, he asked. Who do you say I am? Peter answered, you are the Messiah. Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke to them plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan, he said. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. In these verses, we see how Peter sees, but his vision needs to be corrected. Just like the blind man that Jesus has just healed. Jesus is opening Peter's eyes to who he really is. You know, we need to give credit to Peter for recognizing who Jesus was, even though Jesus has opened his eyes. The culture around him was saying that Jesus was just a special man called by God. But Peter recognized that Jesus was the Messiah, the one who had come to defeat evil and injustice. But Jesus explained that the Messiah had come to die, not live, and he was radically different. He had come to lose power, not take it. He had come to serve, not rule. And that's how he's going to defeat evil and put everything right. You know, Peter gave Jesus some rage because when he was growing up, you know, he was told that the Messiah would come and defeat evil by just smashing everyone. Never before in this moment in Israel's history had anyone connected the Messiah with suffering. Jesus was opening Peter's eyes to who he really was. Jesus then goes on to open the disciples' eyes to what it means to follow Jesus. Let's read verses 34 to 37. Then he called the crowds to him along with the disciples and said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for his soul? You know, Jesus took up his cross, so we should take up our cross. But what does that mean? When Jesus said that the way to follow him was to take up our cross, he meant at least this: be willing to be opposed, to suffer, to be shamed, and to die, all for loyalty to him. Or to go to the heart of the matter, it means to treasure Jesus more than we treasure human approval, respect, comfort, and life. Isn't this so radically different the way we are told to live? Being a Christian isn't just an add-on. It's radical. And our suffering is not a tribute to Jesus unless we endure it because we cherish Jesus. Taking up our cross means Jesus has become more precious to us than approval, respect, comfort, and life. You know, the world tells us to live for pleasure, to live for comfort, to look after number one. The world tells us that that's real life, but we know that that doesn't satisfy. Living like this, it only brings misery and for us and for everyone around us. A preacher once said, "There's nothing that makes you more miserable than self-absorption." Living for Jesus is so radically different to living for ourselves. How are we avoiding the cross right now? Are we trying to avoid the cross? Are we trying to avoid suffering through money? Are we trying to find security, peace, and safety in a healthy bank balance? Are we trying to get enough money to quiet our fears and worries? Are we overworking to the point of exhaustion? Are you at risk of losing yourself and losing your soul for the sake of money? Are you wasting your life chasing after money? If you do, in the end, you will lose your soul. We must come to see that security, peace, and safety can only come through Jesus. He is the one who has purchased our souls for eternity through his death on the cross. We can try and avoid suffering through the mates we have in our life. You know, do we mainly hang around with people like us? Do we avoid people who are different because it will be difficult? Or maybe we stay away from people altogether because we don't want the hassles of real relationships. Do we only enter relationships so we can get things like acceptance and love? So we can be listened to and cared for? Taking up our cross means entering into relationships where it's painful, where we might risk getting hurt, where it's messy, where it puts us out of our comfort zone, where we listen to problems, where we bear each other's burdens, where we may get nothing in return, where it costs us. All because Jesus loves messed up people like you and me so much that he suffered and died an agonizing death on the cross to save us from hell. Taking up our cross means we think Jesus is better than human approval. We live for him rather than for others. Maybe we do things our family wants us to do, even though we know what's wrong in Jesus' eyes. An example I can think of is when someone asked me to lie to the post office about what they were posting. Don't worry, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't that dodgy. I said no, and as a result, they kicked off and said to me, "Oh, you're that honest now, are you?" And they didn't speak to me for a day or so. In the past, they would have just done it for their approval and for an easy life. But now I won't do it. It doesn't mean I'm perfect in this area, because I'm not. But I don't want to deny Jesus' call on my life in that moment to suffer for him, after all that he's done for me. Taking up our cross means making sacrifices with our time. Not just doing what we want to do with our time. But it means doing things sometimes we don't want to do. It means sacrificing our time because Jesus gave his life for us to save our souls. Things like praying, reading our Bible, meeting up with other Christians, going to church stuff online or in person, all for the good of others and ourselves. And it goes against that part of us that wants to do the easiest thing, the comfortable things that require no effort. This is a really radical call on our lives. It's not what we really want to do. It's not what we really want to hear. And I know this week that I haven't loved people like Jesus loves people. Naturally, we just want to live for ourselves. But Jesus' call on our lives is radical. Is he worth making the sacrifice for? The disciples became convinced that it was, and they gave their lives to follow Jesus. You know, we need to help each other to take up our cross and follow Jesus daily. How are we helping others to do this in the church? How are you responding when others call you to live radical lives for Jesus? Do we have those types of relationships in church at the moment? If not, why not? There might be loads of reasons why we don't. And how can we develop those types of relationships? We need those types of relationships because our souls are at stake. Remember I said at the start that most team sports require that you look up away from the ball to have vision. Because if you just focus on the ball, you won't be able to see where your teammates are, or you won't be able to see the oncoming attackers. In order to have vision, you have to look up. What helps is when your teammates shout out your name and give you direction because they can see better than you. Or when your gaffer on the sideline gives you instructions. But in order to have better vision, you have to listen. Listening to Jesus improves our spiritual vision. He needs to open our eyes to who he really is and what it means to live for him.